Hey guys, and welcome back to Grace of a Military Child and Life podcast. Life from the perspective of a military family member is way different than a civilian standpoint. Military children and family members give up their hopes and dreams to be able to stand by and support their service member, and it isn't an easy lifestyle for anyone to live. I hope that this podcast is able to help connect the military community and give others just a glimpse into what the military life is like from the perspective of spouses and children. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Grace of a Military Child and Life podcast. Today, I'm here with Andrea. Welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me. How are you?
Yes, of course. I'm doing good. So tell me to start what your life has been like with the military involved.
So I grew up as a military kid, but my dad did get out when I was kind of young. He was a pilot in the Air Force. And now both my little brothers are pilots in the Air Force. My sister-in-law is on a plane in the Air Force, and I'm not in the Air Force, but I do work for Military Times as my day job. I'm the editor of Marine Corps Times. And then I help run a podcast as well called the Spouse Angle Podcast. We wanted to create a brand for military spouses to give them better news. So I'm in the military community, but I'm not actually military. My boyfriend's in the Army. But just a big supporter and advocate for military and working in the military journalism space.
Yeah. What was it like growing up military? My dad retired when I was 12. So, I didn't have as much experience like moving around or anything. But what was it like for you growing up military?
We didn't have a ton of that either. My dad was kind of strategic and he got out and got hired by the airlines when they were booming. And to be honest, I didn't really consider him military, right? Like he was a pilot. We were with the pilot community. So we grew up very much like in the aviation community. We were, always looking to the sky at the planes flying overhead, talking about planes, going to all the base air museums and talking about the planes that both my grandfathers used to fly in. So, when it came time for me to even possibly join, I didn't consider the military because I truly didn't know there were other jobs besides being a pilot, and both my little brothers have followed in their step, in my dad's steps. So yeah, we were just really inspired by flying and, just kind of the excitement and adventure that dad got to have there.
Yeah. Is there like a reason? I mean, you mentioned not knowing other jobs besides pilots, but is there like a specific reason that you didn't want to join the military, or did you kind of have another career path in mind at the time?
I truly never considered it until a little bit later. I wish I would have known in college, like the opportunities for ROTC again, like those were things my brother was thinking about with the Air Force. He was very meticulous about the degree that he wanted to get, the ROTC program he wanted to get so that he would get his pilot slot. I knew, I would like to learn to fly. I started working on my glider pilot license, but I don't have this same sort of drive, to be a jet fighter pilot that my brothers had. So my gift was always reading and writing, and I didn't really know that there were, any opportunities for those sort of jobs in the military, which now I know there are. But so yeah, I went into school for journalism, and I'm definitely following, the path that's best for me there. It was when I started getting a little older and realizing, there's Marine public affairs. Like I didn't even know what public affairs or public relations was in high school when I was picking my degree, right? So I didn't really know there were communication experts in the military or even intel jobs or other things that could use the skills that I had. So no, I didn't consider it. I'm always tempted possibly, maybe I should join the reserves on the side. But I think my job at Military Times has been such a gift because I'm taking the path that was meant for me, which is journalism and writing, and using it to support this community that I really care about and that needs good news and needs good journalists and, objective journalists covering them. So I think I kind of get the best of both worlds. Like, I get to interview Marine generals and then tell my brothers about it. And they think that's pretty cool.
Yeah. How did you get involved with doing all of that? Did you kind of like just research when you were looking for jobs, or did you find it somewhere? How did you get involved with that?
So it wasn't my first job. I actually didn't know what I wanted to do in college. I didn't know what a journalist was, but I had a great career counselor who was like, let's not look at the job you want. Let's look at what classes excite you. Yeah. And I only thought, being good at reading or writing, and I could be an English teacher. Like leaving high school, that's all that I knew. But it didn't quite sit right. And when I looked at the English classes, I love Shakespeare, I love literature, but they didn't excite me as much when I read classes about like podcasting or classes about video editing or editing magazine articles. And I didn't know in college what I wanted to do, which of those paths. So I kind of tried them all. I took all the TV classes. I did major in print journalism. And then I was just lucky enough to get magazine jobs actually after college. Mostly I started with copy editing and then like some fact checking jobs and then an associate editor of a magazine. And that's what moved me to DC was that job. And honestly, I just needed a new job. I was kind of looking all over the place at any magazine job. Marine Corps Times was a newspaper at the time. We're a magazine now. But, I thought I didn't know much about the Marine Corps, but I knew about the military and applied. And, they thought it was a good fit as well. But it was more my journalism background. They did ask me, they said, you have really good reporting experience, but you have no examples of military reporting. And I said, oh, my dad was an A-10 pilot. And they said, oh, you're fine. They just wanted to know, like, can you speak to people in this community? Do you understand, like how they might think or how to interact with them? And I did. So it's been a great fit for me.
Yeah. The military community is so different where, it's easier if you can relate to them and then, start telling them, the stories, the news and things like that, and being able to speak to their level rather than just jotting out the news like you would on any other platform.
Absolutely. We have a lot of veterans at Military Times, which helps too. And I think it's good to have both views, right? So like I'll edit a story written by a veteran and he maybe has more intricate knowledge of the Marine Corps, but then I can ask questions as an outsider saying, well, what does this mean and why? We need to make sure we explain that. So I think together having both perspectives has been really helpful.
Right. Because you'll get spouses, who read, these stories and these articles and be like, okay, I don't know that acronym or, what that specific thing means. And so having you kind of in that outsider position to say, hey, this might get a little confusing, and being able to clarify those points and details.
Absolutely.
Yeah. My fiance is a Marine and my dad was Army. So I kind of grew up in the Army lifestyle and then the Marine, and even between different branches, it's so different. The ranks are different. The skill sets are different. The jobs, both of them had a very similar job and career field. And it's like, okay, you're very similar, but you're so different in your own ways too, because of the different branches. So you really never know, how to communicate specifically to a branch.
Absolutely. My boyfriend's Army, and this has been like my first foray into the Army, and I have no idea what's going on, but even at Military Times, it's funny between the papers, like, every paper is so different because each branch, their audience is so different. So it's really been fun learning and getting to know people across the whole military.
Yeah. When you were kind of in like the dating world, were you looking for someone in the military? Was that even a thought for you? Because for me, it was not. I was like, no, I'm not doing that. And then, it just happens out of nowhere.
That's such a funny question. No one's ever asked me that publicly. The honest truth is, like, I think I was very drawn to people in the military. And that's because my dad is just like very straight-laced, type A, not straight-laced, that's not wrong, but just like very successful, like in his job and in his discipline. And I was living in Washington, D.C., and I was like, I'm just meeting a bunch of like people who were like, seeking after money, perhaps, or like politics. And I wasn't drawn to that. Like I'm very drawn to somebody who is selfless. And, a lot of the innate qualities that I was looking for, like, are the types of people who would join the military. Somebody who has, character and is like, living for something greater than themselves, and, those sort of decisions, why people sometimes choose the military. So I was dating a bunch of military guys for a while, I think. I tried not to, like it was definitely not fun. Like, you meet a guy and then they move and you're like, oh, okay. And it certainly wasn't my only criteria. Definitely not. But I do think, like, I think it's pretty badass. Yeah. I think it's attractive.
Yeah. I was like, my dad was injured in Afghanistan too. So like I saw a completely like the traumatic side of it and was like, I'm not dealing with this. I'm not putting myself through this again. I'm not putting my kids through this. And then, I mean, out of nowhere, it's like, okay, well, and I've loved the military lifestyle. I love, talking to other military kids and spouses and, people involved in the military community. And, getting back into it, it's like, this is family. Like, I can't necessarily just leave it. And even though like my dad was Army and he's a Marine, my dad's like, you still got Army blood in you. Like that's never going to change. You might add some Marine, but you never truly leave the military life.
I do feel like the community is it feels right. It fits right. Like, I'm drawn to, even, you asked the question about dating, like even unintentionally, I end up finding people who have some connections to the military just because they're people like me and they, have some of the same experiences or mindsets. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right on that. Was there something that you had to like mentally go through to like make that decision to date him and get over that hump of not wanting to follow that military path?
So it was so kind of just sporadic of how we even started dating, because he was stationed in Okinawa, Japan, and he came home for Christmas, and he was friends with my dad before he was even friends with me. And so he came home and it was his first time home in 2 years because of COVID. And he wanted to see my dad because he just, had the respect for my dad. And, they're both military, so they get it. And, they can bond over that and everything. And then my mom was like, you should, ask him if he wants to get lunch or coffee or something. And, not necessarily as like a date, but just as friends. And I was like, yeah, no, I don't do that. Like, that's going to sound like it's a date and I have school on Monday and no. So, no, Monday we ended up going out on a date because I was like, if you think this has any chance of happening, then, you can work with his mom on that and, get that all settled. And then, it just happened. Like, there was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. My mom was like, she told me the night before or something. She was like, you cannot, go out with him and then change your mind again and be like, okay, you're military, I cannot do this. And then, we've been together just over 6 months now. And it's like, okay, it's hard, but it's worth it in the end. Like, even texts or video calls that I get from him because he's still away right now, it's worth it. It makes it all worth it.
Yeah, I'm lucky that I'm physically close to my boyfriend right now, but my brothers are far. One of my brothers is in England now and one is in North Dakota. So yeah, it definitely changes the way you have to be intentional with the way you communicate and how much you have to value those times you do have together in person.
Yeah, because he's in school right now. And so, he can't have his phone on him or anything. And so it's like, I'll get a text in the morning and I'll get a text when he gets off, but he's so busy that it's like, okay, when we have the time to communicate, you have to make it, you have to be intentional with it. Like you said, you can't like be like, okay, complaining about all the little things. Like, you have to enjoy those moments that you have while you have them.
Absolutely. I think it's good lessons to learn. It's hard, but it's, I think it's good. It's sweet in the end.
Yeah, it is. And I'm like, this is all worth it. I get to travel the world, My dad was reserved, so we didn't PCS much. And so I'm like, okay, you're active duty. I can, move around a little bit more and see the world and, experience military lifestyle and the community, and my kids can grow up in it. And it's like, it's exciting.
The Marine Corps community is really tight. It's been fun to work with Marines. Hard,
Yeah.
but also very rewarding as well. I think still an outsider in that community. I have to be, as a journalist,
Right.
but I do see the amount of camaraderie that the Marines have, and it's really impressive.
Yeah, it's definitely a special connection between them. And I haven't been like with him and Marines around him really. It's just been like, my dad, but even, the connection between him and my dad. And then when I'm on like video call with him and he's with his Marines, it's like, or even the way he just talks about them, you can tell that there's that bond between them. And I mean, that's any branch too. Just the bond between, service members and, even their families to an extent too. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about the podcast that you have and how you started that and kind of the idea behind that.
Yeah, so I actually started it with a former coworker. She was formerly at Military Times. We were there together. We both did the same grad program at Georgetown. She convinced me to do it. It was a great journalism program. And so we weren't super close, but we would have, lunches every couple months and kind of talk about school and our careers. And she had a separate idea, actually, when she became pregnant. It was after she had the baby. She was nursing, and the nursing room in our office at the time was the podcast room. So she likes to tell the story. She was in there pumping and was kind of like, oh, wow, I should do a podcast. She was inspired for that. And I actually was inspired during a class at Georgetown at my program called Entrepreneurial Media, or something about entrepreneurship and media. And I remember thinking, like, I am not an entrepreneur. I have no idea about business, but I actually don't think that's true. I'm actually a big ideas person. I just was kind of like belittling my own knowledge because I didn't know much about like business law or tax or, all the little nitty gritties. But when it came down to it, to our final presentation, I presented that we needed a news brand for military spouses. I think even Military Times, our readership is like 75% male. Even just from a perspective of like marketing and advertising, like it's better to have more women in your audience than, 75% to 25%. And so I kind of presented this case and then a little bit later, I was furloughed during the pandemic for 4 months. So I skipped a step. Natalie and I had this lunch, and she was like, I'm going to stay at home, be a full-time mom. And I would like to do a military spouse podcast. I'm like, well, I would like to do a military spouse news brand, but I don't have the time. I don't know how to do it. And then not long after, I was furloughed due to the pandemic and had, 4 months of time to apply for jobs. Luckily, I got my job back. We got everything back in order at our company, but, it was uncertain times. And yeah, so it was during that time we really got the podcast up and going. I built the website. I had plenty of time to do so. And we became an LLC, that spring 2020, and got the ball rolling. So we just saw, kind of like you said earlier, like spouses can go to some of these news brands and it's still geared toward the service member, right? So they're not necessarily giving the same answers to the questions that military spouses would ask. They're maybe giving more technical answers, more jargon, more, just a different angle. And that's how we came up with the name, is we wanted to come at it from literally the spouse's angle and give them the information and news that they need to feel supported in their own community and in their, talking about things that are going on in that military spouse community.
Yeah. And that's so important. And, there was such a gap in, the way things were conveyed to spouses. And most of the time it's the service member coming home saying, this is what's happening. Like, and now there's something for the spouses to go to be like, hey, this is what's happening. And this is what's happening in your words, like in words that you can understand.
That's our goal. We've been growing a lot and are, starting to get more news on the website, and the podcast has just been booming. So we're, Natalie and I are so humbled, like not being military spouses, not even being military. Her dad was in the Army as well. He was in the Army band for most of her childhood. So we like to say we're former, retired military kids.
Yeah.
So it's just been such a blessing to be welcomed in this community and able to report on what we do, because we are trained journalists and we think it's important that good, solid news is coming out. And by good, I mean just like well written and balanced and giving the highest level bar of journalism to service members and their communities. So
yeah, well, that's amazing. The last question I always like to ask is, what advice would you give to another military kid?
Oh man. Well, I mean, maybe know that there's other jobs in the military besides the one your parents did. What advice would I give? I do. That is one of my regrets, is just not knowing the opportunities that are out there. I think, I'm not a military spouse, but I think there's so much support. There's so many nonprofits and advocacy groups, like I did a podcast I filled in for Natalie this week, and they're talking about military spouse entrepreneurs and all these free programs that some of these universities are hosting. Like there's a lot of people who really want to help military families and military kids, but like, unless you're really active in finding those groups and finding the one that fits you in the right location. And, it can be daunting, I think, the amount of help that's there. But like as an outsider, just like, I want you guys to be involved in this. Like even my boyfriend, he's an entrepreneur. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And he's in the Army. But it's like, there's so many resources for you. Like you could be part of this group and part of this group. And so I guess my advice would be like, don't get stuck in your own little like idea of what the military is, because there is so much more to it, whether that's your community, your branch, like there's other jobs, there might be other ways that you can contribute, whether that's in an official way or an unofficial way on base and getting involved in some sort of volunteering. But also there's a lot of people who want to help you, and there's a lot of resources. And so that's something we're trying to do at the Spouse Angle, is like make those resources like more available and make spouses more aware. So yeah, I guess that would be my advice, is to keep continuing to open your eyes, because there's new things available to support military families every day, and they deserve all the support.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast and sharing your story and, your experiences and about the Spouse Angle podcast as well.
It was so great to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Grace of a Military Child and Life. Make sure to set a reminder for every Tuesday to listen to a new episode. You can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Grace of a Military Child and Life. If you have any questions or want to be on the podcast, send a message to one of our social media platforms or email grace.of.a.military.child@gmail.com. See you next week.